Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Oh, hi. I didn't know
Wrong
you'd
protocol.
already done it.
Okay, we're in the Pure Worship book, page 156.
Yes.
And we're dealing with one subhead at this point, which is lofty gates.
Mm-hmm.
So what are they going to make the lofty gates mean?
Right.
So I'm going to be reading from the screen and Vivian from the book.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. When we contemplate those towering gates that Ezekiel saw, what lessons can we learn? That aspect of the visionary temple no doubt taught the Jewish exiles that Jehovah has very high moral standards. If that was true in ancient times, what about today? We worship in Jehovah's great spiritual temple. Is not upright conduct free from hypocrisy even more important now? During the last days, Jehovah has progressively guided his people to follow closely his standards of moral conduct. For example, unrepentant wrongdoers are removed from the congregation. And they use, of course, their classic proof text, 1 Corinthians 5:11-13. We should note here, before we forget, that this standard was only arrived at in the early 1950s. So for some like 75 years of your history, you didn't know anything about expelling the wicked. But Christendom did, and oftentimes, interestingly, you criticize Christendom for expelling the wicked in their own way over the centuries, but you got around to it in the early 50s.
I think the other thing is, this says unrepentant wrongdoers. And for a fact, they disfellowship people even when they're repentant, because they don't think they're repentant enough.
Or critics.
Or it's scandalous, or they disagree
They're
with
critics.
them.
Yeah, this is not exactly the context.
Yeah.
We'll get into that more in a minute. What is more, the guard chambers and the entryways of those gates may remind us that today, when it comes to worshiping Jehovah, no one is admitted who does not have divine approval. Well, that's different than then. For instance, a person who is leading a double life might enter a kingdom hall, but he cannot gain Jehovah's approval until he makes things right with God. What a marvelous protection for pure worship in these debased, immoral times. I think we've got to say right away, though, again before we forget, that no, all Jews were supposed to come to the temple to worship, whether they were moral or immoral.
Yeah. The next paragraph says, the Bible foretold that this world would become debased before the end. Wicked men and impostors, we read, will advance from bad to worse, misleading and being misled. More and more people today are being misled into thinking that Jehovah's high standards are overly strict, out of date, or just wrong. Will you be misled? For example, if someone tries to convince you that God's standards regarding homosexual conduct are mistaken, will you agree with him? Or will you agree with Jehovah God, whose word clearly states that those who carry out such acts are working what is obscene? God warns us against approving of immoral conduct. When confronted with such issues, we do well to picture Ezekiel's visionary temple with those lofty gates, and remember, Jehovah does not lower his righteous standards, regardless of pressures from this wicked world. Do you agree with our Heavenly Father and stand up for what is right?
Well, again, it's something of a straw man, because they're trying to make the case, as they habitually do, that everybody out there doesn't have these high, lofty standards that we have. Let it be said clearly that there are hundreds of millions of Christians out there who agree with your lofty standards about sexuality.
Yeah.
And some are far stricter, by the way, in other ways that you are not, if you're Jehovah's Witnesses. And the charge of hypocrisy, of course, this rings very hollow now, even a few years after this is written, with all the scandals that have come forth since about cover-ups of sexually debased activity.
Yeah.
So it's a non-point, really, in terms of comparing your high standards against the standards of what other claimants to be Christians. The world standards, well, that's easy. That's an easy straw man to burn, isn't it? But the churches have at least as high moral standards. That is, hundreds of millions of Christians and entire denominations have the same standards on sexuality as you do.
Yeah, and I mean, you can point to churches that don't have high standards, who are making excuses, But that's just a select.
Yeah.
A select group of people. It's not all of Christians.
No.
Who don't have high moral standards.
In case you don't know, just in recent years in America, we've had two great denominations, denominations bigger than the Watchtower in America, that have split over this very issue.
Yeah.
The Methodists in the United States, I think, the most recent of those, but other denominations have split down the middle, millions sticking to the original sexual standards, and some creating new denominations, in effect, that are woke.
And then you go to other countries where they're very, very steadfast in this area.
Yeah, you don't see Christians in Africa, for instance, and there's hundreds of millions of them fighting over sexuality in the same way we do here.
No.
Yeah, but even this idea that we have, well, look at the phrasing in the paragraph 18 that again references to visionary temple and spiritual temple, two different things.
Yeah.
But then when you get to the high standards that you think you uniquely represent, they say during the last days, Jehovah has progressively guided his people to follow closely his standards of moral conduct. And you use an example of shunning policy, as if that's something to brag about. And we do know witnesses in our circle of friends and ex-witnesses. Yes, many are stuck with this idea that we're the only people in the world who have this high moral standard, that we shun people who dare disagree or dare compromise in sexual ways. But the example you use as usual is 1 Corinthians 5. This is what you say is the right thing to do with all such people who are, what you call them, unrepentant wrongdoers. They're removed from the congregation. But the text you use, 1 Corinthians 5, cannot be used to prove that. Because it's about a public scandal, and it's not being dealt with, by the way, by the elders. But like Matthew 18, where you have Christ talking about what the congregation should do in the case of things that can't be resolved, misconduct being, of course, one of them, what do? The whole congregation takes the responsibility to administer discipline to such ones.
Yeah.
In 1 Corinthians 5, by contrast, you have the example that was known about by everybody, not just the whole congregation.
But the world.
But the world knew about this man.
And it was an extreme scandalous occasion. This was public knowledge, and they had to act on it, but with the point of view of this will redeem the man in the end. That was always the goal.
We've done a whole video on it, and we'll link to that at the end. But it needs to be said that this is the only example in the whole 29 chapters of the 2 Corinthian epistles. The only time that Paul recommends this method of discipline is in the case of a public scandal.
And he's dealing with the Corinthians, and Corinth was a city of low morals, for sure. So the congregation was made up of people who had been living immoral lives. So this must have been an ongoing struggle for this community. And so I think this is another reason why he recommends this in this case. This is what you were. And then he's encouraging them. And I think the Matthew scripture shows you that it's not a never even speak to a person. This is the Watchtower's recommendation, is you don't even speak to these people. How are these people helped if you don't speak to them? How are they given some support to help them get past their struggle?
Yeah.
If you just say, no one can talk to you.
The Matthew 18 principle is if he won't listen to a brother, that is the brother who has the complaint, or a friend of his who he takes along, then you take it to, not the elders, but the congregation.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't listen to the congregation, then let him become as a tax collector. Well, tax collectors you didn't shun. You couldn't afford to shun them.
You had to have some contact and conversation with them. But you treat them as a tax collector. Well, how were they treated? They were more or less, they weren't on your social list of fellowship.
No,
people that you would invite over or be chummy with.
But even there, Christ corrected that misapprehension of what treating like a tax collector means. You don't socialize with them and enjoy their company with a view to becoming like them, or with the risk of becoming like them. You avoid their society, you could say. Table fellowship is not acceptable. That's plainly in 1 Corinthians 5:2. So expel the wicked man does not mean completely avoid him. And you get in 2 Corinthians the idea that, no, you can take that principle too far. 2 Corinthians seems to be correcting misapprehension about this very thing. So this idea that, well, the people who lead a double life can enter a kingdom hall but can't gain Jehovah's approval, well, the church believes that too. You know?
Yeah.
And you haven't got a better record.
Yeah.
When it comes to double life, you haven't got a better record than the churches you habitually criticize.
Yeah.
So I would say that when you get to the next paragraph, 19, not only do millions agree with you about these sexual standards, but they're having the same struggle that you see very much in 1 Corinthians itself. If you go from 5 to 6 in 1 Corinthians, where he says something, words that you're very familiar with if you read Watchtower publications, which is those people who are unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom. And then he gives you a list of such people, including homosexuals.
But he also includes things like drunkardness and...
Yeah, and we know that a lot of witnesses have a problem with alcoholism. Jehovah's righteous standards, well, I think we all know what they are. But the point is, what do you do with people who don't attain those righteous standards?
Yeah.
You like you said before, you don't offer them practical help. You cast them forth to make their own way and find their own way back without your help.
And they have to correct this struggle on their own and then come back.
Yeah.
You know, so these people don't get any help, really, from the witnesses.
They have to prove they're righteous before you'll accept them in.
Yeah.
And that's when Paul says they won't inherit God's kingdom, he's not talking about he's not talking about the church. He's talking about the ultimate kingdom. You don't allow them back in your company until they prove themselves repentant.
And just because this is all in the setting of Ezekiel and the temple, think about that. Who was going to the temple? It was people who were sinners. So they all had different kinds of sins that they had to go to the temple and sacrifice. They were all offering sacrifices.
Yeah.
For there wasn't an elite class within who were doing everything right, and it was just, you know, the really bad guys had to come up and offer sacrifice. They were all aware. They were self-aware that they were sinners.
But even among the Jews, as we can plainly see from the Gospels, there were those who considered themselves righteous, like the Pharisees, and there were many Jews who the Pharisees, would consider unrighteous. But they were all commanded to go to the same temple and offer sacrifices for their personal sins. Yeah. And that's a great leveler, which you don't see in Pharisaic religions like Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. What was our link?
We're linking to a video about sex and sects, sects, in Corinth.
Which takes up the 1 Corinthians 5 passage, yeah.
And the second one takes up the Matthew text. When do Jehovah's Witnesses ever tell it to the congregation?
Yeah, indeed. See you next time.